Before the headlines, before the arrests, before the world knew their names, they were just shadows, moving through quiet neighborhoods, unnoticed, unstoppable. This isn't just history. This is the story of how America became obsessed with the monsters who lived next door. Welcome to Decades of Death, where each episode peels back the layers of time to uncover the serial killers who shaped a nation's deepest fears. One body, one decade, one nightmare at a time. The 1980s in America, a decade drenched in fluorescent lights, booming capitalism, and the illusion of suburban safety, was also the golden age of serial killers, where beneath the surface of prosperity and progress, darkness crawled quietly through alleys, highways, and neighborhoods across the country. In this chilling decade, society witnessed the terrifying evolution of evil with figures like Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who prowled the Pacific Northwest, targeting vulnerable sex workers and leaving behind a trail of strangled bodies that baffled authorities for decades. A man so ordinary in appearance yet so monstrous in nature that he would eventually confess to the murder of at least 71 women. Then there were the horrifying duo Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, whose remote cabin in Northern California became a chamber of sadistic torture, slavery, and execution, their crimes meticulously documented on videotape, revealing a level of premeditated cruelty that shocked even seasoned investigators. And looming over Los Angeles was the satanic shadow of Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker, whose reign of terror left a city paralyzed with fear as he crept into homes under the cover of darkness, murdering with randomness, cruelty, and a demonic devotion that earned him a cult-like infamy. These killers didn't just murder. They rewrote the psychological map of America, forcing law enforcement to rethink criminal profiling, inspiring the rise of the FBI's behavioral science unit, and feeding a media frenzy that turned murder into nightly news and courtroom drama into primetime entertainment. Behind the bloodshed were broken systems, overloaded police departments, lack of interagency communication, and a cultural ignorance of mental illness and trauma that allowed these predators to hunt for years, sometimes decades, before justice caught up. As DNA technology stood on the brink of revolutionizing crime solving, these cases set the stage for modern forensic science, while their legacy still echoes in the collective memory of a nation haunted by the question: how many more walked among us, unnoticed, unseen, untouched by suspicion? And so begins our journey into the blood-stained corridors of America's past, one decade at a time, where horror wore a human face and terror had a zip code. The 1970s were a turbulent storm in American history, a time of post-Vietnam disillusionment, civil unrest, shifting sexual norms, and decaying urban centers. And it was in this chaotic atmosphere that some of the most infamous serial killers in modern history emerged, casting a long, dark shadow across the nation and turning once trusted strangers into symbols of unthinkable horror. This was the decade when the name Ted Bundy became etched in blood across the Pacific Northwest and beyond, as the seemingly charming law student and aspiring politician used his good looks and intelligence to lure young women to their deaths, often impersonating someone in need, before kidnapping, raping, and brutally murdering them, sometimes revisiting their corpses in secret. His crimes so calculated and cold that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend his lack of remorse. In Chicago, the twisted facade of John Wayne Gacy, the so-called killer clown, shattered all illusions of safety as he buried the bodies of at least 29 teenage boys beneath his suburban home, all while performing at children's parties in full clown costume, a gruesome duality that would come to symbolize the hidden horrors behind ordinary faces. And in New York City, terror had a name: David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, who prowled the streets during the city's hottest summer, targeting young couples with a .44 caliber revolver and claiming he was driven by demonic possession. His letters to the press, feeding a firestorm of paranoia that gripped the city and led to the largest manhunt in NYPD history. But it wasn't just the killers who defined the decade. It was also the deep institutional failings that let them flourish, from inadequate police coordination and lack of centralized criminal databases, to public ignorance about serial behavior and the psychological profiles that were just beginning to form under the FBI's newly developed behavioral science unit. The 1970s also saw the rise of a media frenzy that sensationalized violence, created killer celebrities, and often overshadowed the voices of victims and survivors. Yet out of this horror emerged critical advancements in profiling, forensic psychology, and interagency collaboration that would later revolutionize criminal investigations. In a time of rotary phones and handwritten records, many of these monsters slipped through cracks again and again, protected by jurisdictional blind spots and societal denial, leaving America to wake up, finally, to a truth it could no longer ignore. That evil didn't always wear a mask. It wore a smile, a badge, a tie, or a clown suit, and it was already inside the house. The 1970s was the dawn of America's obsession with serial murder, and its darkest secrets still whisper in old court files, faded Polaroids, and the haunted testimonies of those who survived. The 1960s, remembered by many as a decade of peace, protest, and revolution, was also the era when America's innocence began to fracture. And behind the psychedelic colors, anti-war chants, and civil rights marches, the shadows of evil quietly stretched across cities and countrysides, laying the groundwork for a new breed of criminal who murdered not for money or revenge, but for power, pleasure, and infamy. Among the most terrifying was the elusive Zodiac Killer, a sadistic predator who taunted police and the public with cryptic letters, ciphers, and grotesque threats, striking randomly across Northern California and claiming victims in lovers' lanes, on city streets, and even in broad daylight. His identity remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in American history, leaving a legacy of fear, speculation, and obsession that endures to this day. While the Zodiac played his deadly mind games, Charles Whitman, a former Marine, climbed to the top of the University of Texas Tower in 1966 and carried out one of the first modern mass shootings, killing 16 people and wounding dozens more with calculated precision, marking the beginning of a horrifying new trend in American violence that would scar the national psyche for generations. Then came Albert DeSalvo, the self-confessed Boston Strangler, whose reign of terror saw 13 women, mostly elderly and alone, brutally assaulted and strangled in their homes. His confessions questioned to this day as investigators still debate whether one man committed all the killings or if a darker truth remains buried. The 1960s also introduced America to a growing awareness of psychological disorders and criminal pathology. Yet the tools to understand or stop serial offenders were still in their infancy. Profiling didn't exist, interagency cooperation was rare, and killers could cross state lines with near impunity, exploiting a system unprepared for monsters who looked like neighbors, war heroes, or working-class nobodies. Meanwhile, sensational media coverage, often portraying killers as diabolical geniuses or twisted masterminds, began feeding a public craving for horror and mystery, blurring the line between justice and spectacle. In this volatile decade, the seeds of modern serial homicide were planted, not yet fully understood, but undeniably dangerous, foreshadowing the explosion of violence that would erupt in the decades to come. With each unsolved case and every unanswered letter, the 1960s didn't just deliver death. It whispered that evil could be clever, calculating, and, perhaps most disturbingly, never caught. The 1950s are often romanticized as a golden age in American culture, where post-war prosperity reigned, suburban families bloomed, and wholesome values were broadcast in black and white. But behind the polished smiles, picket fences, and the scent of fresh apple pie, darkness was quietly spreading, infecting the American dream with a new kind of evil that no one wanted to believe could exist in such a civilized era. It was during this time that Ed Gein, a shy and reclusive handyman from rural Wisconsin, stunned the nation when authorities discovered a grotesque collection of human remains in his farmhouse. Furniture made from bones, masks crafted from human skin, and a suit sewn from the flesh of dead women, revealing a level of depravity so disturbing it inspired fictional monsters like Norman Bates, Buffalo Bill, and Leatherface, cementing Gein as the grandfather of horror. Meanwhile, Harvey Glattman, dubbed the Lonely Hearts Killer, preyed on aspiring models by luring them through fake modeling ads, tying them up, photographing them in terrified poses, then murdering them, his crimes eerily foreshadowing the sadistic rituals of future serial predators and earning him the title of America's first modern serial killer in terms of method and motive. While not yet coined as serial killers, these men operated under the radar in an America unprepared for such pathology. Criminal profiling didn't exist, psychology was barely integrated into law enforcement, and the idea that multiple murders could be committed by one seemingly normal man wasn't even part of police vocabulary. This was an age when people didn't lock their doors, when trust was freely given to neighbors and strangers alike, and when horror was expected to stay on the movie screen, not in the barn next door. But the 1950s proved that even in the most polished era, brutality thrived in silence, hiding behind politeness, shame, and the inability to face what America was just beginning to understand. That some people kill not out of anger or desperation, but out of desire, and they could be sitting right across from you at the dinner table, smiling. The 1990s, a time of rising technology, 24-hour news cycles, and the dawn of the internet age, was also the decade when America's fascination with serial killers reached a fever pitch, fueled by court trials turned into primetime theater and killers whose crimes were so depraved, so unthinkable, they became household names. At the center of this dark cultural obsession stood Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, whose arrest in 1991 exposed a nightmare beyond anything the public had imagined. Severed heads in the freezer, photographs of mutilated bodies, and chilling confessions of necrophilia and cannibalism that forced the nation to confront evil in its rawest, most intimate form. Then came Aileen Wuornos, a former sex worker who murdered 7 men along Florida highways and claimed she acted in self-defense against sexual violence, her case polarizing the nation and forcing uncomfortable conversations about gender, trauma, and the criminal justice system, eventually immortalized. In media, movies, and myth, lurking beneath the mainstream headlines was Robert Pickton, a Canadian pig farmer operating just across the border whose farm became a dumping ground for dozens of missing women, many of them from marginalized communities with allegations so gruesome, including feeding bodies to pigs, that it shook the very foundation of public trust in law enforcement's commitment to vulnerable victims. And then there was Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, whose horrifying spree of child and young adult murders in the Soviet Union, finally ending in the early 90s, reminded the world that monstrous evil wasn't bound by borders or ideology. The 1990s were also when serial killers became full-blown media celebrities, their mugshots plastered across magazines, court footage looped on cable TV, and fan letters flooding prison mailboxes, blurring the line between criminal infamy and cultural fascination. Advances in criminal profiling, DNA testing, and interagency databases began to tighten the net around predators, yet systemic failures, like police negligence in Dahmer's case, where officers returned a bleeding teen victim to his killer, proved that even with new tools, justice was still fallible. This was the decade when the public could no longer deny that serial killers weren't just deranged loners. They could be the quiet neighbor, the odd guy at work, the polite man who invited you in for a drink. The 1990s made one truth terrifyingly clear. The monsters weren't just in the shadows anymore. They were among us, hiding in plain sight, and sometimes they were the ones we trusted most. The 2000s ushered in a new millennium with promises of progress, connectivity, and innovation. But as cell phones, CCTV, and DNA forensics grew more advanced. So did the darkness lurking behind digital curtains, as a new breed of serial killers emerged. Quieter, more cunning, more evolved, proving that even in an age of information, evil could still slip through the cracks. Perhaps the most chilling example was Israel Keys, a cold-blooded predator unlike any the FBI had ever seen, who operated without pattern, choosing victims at random, burying kill kits across the country, and avoiding digital trails with terrifying precision. His crimes went unnoticed for years until a final mistake led to his arrest in 2012 and a confession that hinted at a far larger body count than anyone imagined, before he took his own life in prison, leaving behind unanswered questions and a haunting smile. Then there was Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, whose home in the heart of a working class neighborhood reeked of decomposition for months. Yet police failed to act until 11 bodies of missing women were discovered buried and stashed within his property. A case that reignited national outrage over the neglect of marginalized victims. The decade also saw the resurfacing of Dennis Rader, the infamous BTK killer, who had vanished since the late 80s only to return in 2004 with cryptic messages and taunting letters, leading to his capture after a digital slip-up revealed his identity as a seemingly ordinary church deacon and compliance officer, stunning his community and proving that monsters often wear the mask of mundane routine. And across the Atlantic, Stephen Port, the so-called grinder killer, began his spree using online dating apps to lure men, drug them with GHB, and stage their deaths as overdoses, exposing how the digital revolution also opened new doors for manipulation, anonymity, and exploitation. Despite a rapidly expanding arsenal of surveillance tools, street cameras, phone tracking, criminal databases, the 2000s showed us that technology alone wasn't enough to stop evil. Instead, racial bias, bureaucratic failure, and willful ignorance continued to let killers prey on the invisible, the ignored, and the vulnerable. The public, now immersed in 24/7 news, blogs, and social media, began consuming true crime as entertainment. But behind every click, every headline, every Netflix docuseries were real victims, real families, and real horror. In the age of surveillance, the world watched more closely than ever before. Yet somehow the killers kept killing, hidden not by shadows, but by the very systems meant to expose them. The 2010s marked a dramatic shift in the world of serial crime, not because killers stopped, but because for the first time in history, the tide began to turn. Decades-old cold cases were cracked open, killers who once mocked the system were dragged into the light, and technology, long considered a double-edged sword, finally tilted the balance in favor of justice. At the center of this reckoning stood the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the long-feared Golden State Killer, whose 13 murders and 50-plus rapes across California in the 70s and 80s had haunted generations. He had vanished like a ghost, but was finally unmasked in 2018 using genetic genealogy, a revolutionary method that traced crime scene DNA to a distant relative's public family tree, bringing closure to victims who had waited nearly 40 years for answers. This breakthrough didn't just solve one case, it signaled a new era, where the digital footprints of family members could finally expose predators who thought they had outlived their crimes. But even as cold cases were solved, new killers emerged. Bruce MacArthur, a seemingly polite landscaper in Toronto, targeted gay men from marginalized communities and buried their dismembered remains in planters across the city, operating in plain sight for years despite complaints. His case reigniting debates about law enforcement's neglect of LGBTQ+ victims. In the U.S., Todd Kohlhepp, a successful real estate agent with a double life, shocked investigators in 2016 when a missing woman was discovered chained inside a metal storage container on his property. She led police to the graves of multiple victims, revealing a years-long spree hidden beneath a mask of success and charm. And though the 2010s saw fewer classic serial killers, the world watched in horror as mass shooters and spree killers, from Las Vegas to Parkland, blurred the line between serial and mass murder, forcing a national conversation about motive, mental illness, radicalization, and the role of media coverage. All the while, the public's hunger for true crime exploded, birthing a new generation of armchair detectives. Viral podcasts like Serial and Netflix juggernauts like Making a Murderer and Mindhunter, reshaping how we understand crime, justice, and the power of storytelling. But beneath the headlines and hashtags, the 2010s proved one critical truth. Justice, though delayed, is no longer out of reach because in the age of DNA, digital forensics, and collective memory, no killer can truly hide forever. The past may be buried, but the future is watching. The 2020s have only just begun, yet they already carry the eerie weight of a new era in criminal history. One where serial killers no longer operate in the shadows for years undetected, but instead find themselves exposed in real time, with social media, smartphones, surveillance, and citizen investigators turning the public into an ever-watchful jury. This is the decade where the case of the Long Island serial killer Lisk, a mystery that had haunted New York for over a decade, finally took a shocking turn in 2023 when authorities arrested Rex Hoyerman, a seemingly ordinary architect and family man, connected to several murders thanks to cutting-edge forensic evidence, burner phone data, and a digital paper trail he thought he'd erased. The world watched not only the arrest but also the unraveling of his double life live on TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube, with citizen sleuths dissecting every frame in theory. Proof that in the 2020s, crime doesn't just break headlines, it breaks the internet. Meanwhile, emerging cases from around the world have revealed killers who exploit modern tools to mask their horror. Using encrypted messaging apps, dating platforms, and even dark web marketplaces to stalk, lure, and erase victims with disturbing precision. But as technology advances, so does accountability. DNA ancestry websites, facial recognition, geolocation, and AI-enhanced surveillance are now solving crimes that would have remained cold in any previous decade. We've also seen a radical cultural shift in who gets justice, with increasing pressure to investigate the disappearances of Indigenous women, trans victims, and people of color, groups historically ignored by media and law enforcement. Yet, as the world demands transparency, the nature of evil evolves. Some serial killers now blend into online communities, radicalized forums, and incel spaces, driven not just by pathology but by ideology. And while the traditional serial killer archetype may appear to be fading, the psychological signature of predation, control, and ritualized violence still thrives in modern forms, just repackaged with a digital mask. The 2020s also mark the era of AI-powered criminal profiling, predictive policing, and biobehavioral risk analysis, tools that could stop killers before they strike, or raise alarming ethical questions about freedom, privacy, and false positives. In this hyper-connected world, the public no longer just consumes true crime. They shape it, solve it, and sometimes even get it wrong. But one thing is certain. The 2020s have proven that evil no longer hides in the dark. It's caught in 4K, tracked by GPS, and exposed by strangers with smartphones, ensuring that even the cleverest killer is only one algorithm away from being unmasked.